Malleus Maleficarum. Malleus Maleficarum is one of the most dangerous books ever published in the Middle Ages, mainly related to the witch hunts that swept Europe at that time. Written by two Dominican monks, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, it provides detailed guidelines on how to identify, capture, and punish witches. One of the most controversial claims in the book is that women, because of their tendency towards temptation and moral weakness, are more prone to becoming witches than men. The book promoted the idea that witches were a great threat to society, which needed to be destroyed at all costs, including through torture to obtain confessions. At the time of its publication, Malleus Maleficarum greatly influenced Inquisition courts, which often used evidence obtained through torture to declare someone guilty. Across Europe, this led to the execution of thousands of people suspected of being involved in witchcraft practices. These witch hunts peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries, with the number of victims varying between 30,000 to 100,000 people, mostly women. One of the direct influences of this book was the Salem witch trials in America in the late 17th century, which inspired courts in the British colonies to use a similar approach in dealing with allegations of witchcraft. The book also underscores gender inequality, portraying women as more susceptible to demonic temptation, which in turn exacerbates negative views of women in society. Malleus Maleficarum was eventually regarded as one of the most dangerous works in European history, exacerbating superstitious beliefs and injustices against those perceived as different. Summa Theologica. Summa Theologica is Thomas Aquinas' monumental work that serves as a systematic guide in Catholic Christian theology. The book discusses almost all aspects of church teaching, including morality, ethics, law, and theological doctrine. Although it is considered one of the greatest works of theology, Summa Theologica also has a controversial side, especially when it comes to its views on women, non-Christians, and social structure. Aquinas argued that women are lesser beings than men. In the Summa Theologica, he states that women do not have the same intellectual and moral capabilities as men, and therefore they should be under the control of men, especially in the context of family and society. This solidified the patriarchal views that dominated medieval European society and encouraged the oppression of women in various forms. Aquinas also developed the theory of natural law, which became the basis for Catholic moral teaching. While many consider it a wise moral guide, these ideas can also be used to discriminate against people who are considered sinful or do not conform to social norms, non-Christians, or those who are considered heretics. In addition, Aquinas advocated for very strong church and state authority, reinforcing the view that church power should be superior to secular power. This can be dangerous as it allows the church to control social and political life, as well as exacerbating injustice. De Monarchia. De Monarchia is a theoretical work written by Dante Alighieri. In De Monarchia, Dante argues for a universal system of government led by a single imperial monarchy that should be free from the influence of the church. It is one of the most important works that challenge the existing social and political structure of the time, namely the Catholic Church's overpowering dominance over worldly affairs. Dante argued that political and spiritual power should be separated, and that the state should be ruled by an emperor who had absolute authority in worldly affairs without interference from the Pope or the Church. He believed that this universal monarchy was necessary to maintain the peace and well-being of all mankind. In his view, the Church should take care of spiritual affairs, while the state should take care of temporal affairs. However, De Monarchia was potentially very dangerous in the medieval context, especially since the Catholic Church had a very dominant power at the time. By suggesting the separation of church and state powers, Dante indirectly challenged the authority of the Pope, who was not only the spiritual leader of Catholics, but also had great influence in the politics and governance of European countries. Dante also put forward the idea that the emperor was the embodiment of God's power in this world, which risked exacerbating tensions between the Church and the European monarchies. In this context, De Monarchia could be considered a potentially subversive work, as it promoted a more secular governmental structure and challenged the established power of the Pope. In those days, any thought that challenged the authority of the Church could be dangerous and often led to major divisions and conflicts, as seen in the long dispute between the Pope and the monarchs in Europe. Decretum Gratiani, the Liber Iuratus, or Decretum Gratiani, is one of the most important legal texts in the history of canon law of the Catholic Church. Written by Gratian in the 12th century, it compiled and systematized existing church law and combined various council decrees and church regulations into a more structured codification. The Decretum became the cornerstone of law governing almost all aspects of Christian life, including marriage, inheritance, and the relationship between church and state. However, while its original purpose was to tidy up church law, this work also had major repercussions that could be considered harmful, especially in the context of the abuse of church authority. Well, one of the main problems with Liber Iuratus is that it provides the basis for the church's power to control the personal and social lives of Catholics. The laws laid out in this text were often used to justify strict regulations regarding morality, including the persecution of those deemed to be breaking church law, such as heretics, witches, or cultists. For example, the Liber Iuratus provided the basis for the Inquisition tribunals that were instrumental in witch hunts and the execution of those deemed not to be following church teachings correctly. The highly authoritarian view of the church at the time made this text a tool to dominate and control social behavior. The laws contained therein were often used to force people to conform to the teachings of the church with no room for diversity of belief. One of the other harmful effects was how the Decretum cemented the view that the church had a higher power than a secular power. It reinforced the church's authority in regulating the daily lives of Catholics and exacerbates the inequality between church and state. When the power of the church is higher, authoritarian practices such as the persecution of people deemed morally or religiously guilty can be allowed. In medieval times, the Liber Iuratus became a very effective tool in strengthening the church's dominance, which often led to the abuse of power, discrimination, and oppression of those deemed different or heretical. This made the Decretum not only a legal document, but also an ideological weapon that could exacerbate injustices in society. The Book of the Courtier. The Book of the Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione is one of the most influential literary works of the Renaissance. The book contains guidelines for nobles on how they should behave in the presence of the sovereign or in aristocratic society. Although the book is considered an elegant and profound piece of literature, the Book of the Courtier can also be considered dangerous in a social and political context, as it reinforces a strict hierarchical system and conservative views on the role of women. One of the main ideas in the Book of the Courtier is that a nobleman should have a balance between moral virtues and social expertise, such as speaking politely, having diplomatic abilities, as well as showing a good physique. Castiglione depicts the ideal nobleman who must not only be intelligent, but also authoritative, virtuous, and have the ability to manipulate situations to achieve goals. The book served as an etiquette guide for the social life of the nobility and exerted a great influence on the European view of how a nobleman should behave. However, the dangerous side of the book lies in its reinforcement of a very rigid social structure. Castiglione strongly emphasizes the importance of social class and position in the hierarchy of society. It exacerbates social inequality by presuming that people from the lower classes should stay in their place and have no right to challenge the position of the nobility. The book indirectly supports social inequality by giving legitimacy to a feudal system that values social status and descent over individual ability or achievement. The Book of the Courtier also illustrates conservative views on gender roles, particularly in portraying women as objects of beauty and morality who must submit to social norms set by men. Castiglione portrays women as ideally more passive and submissive to men, which supports the view that women do not have the freedom or authority to make independent decisions. This can be dangerous as it exacerbates discrimination against women and limits their opportunities in the social, economic, and political world. As a Renaissance literary work, the Book of the Courtier did have a great influence in shaping the aristocratic culture of the time, but in a modern context, it can be seen as a tool that reinforces unjust social structures and exacerbates inequalities between social classes and genders. The Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy is Dante Alighieri's greatest literary work that describes the journey of the human soul through three realms after death: Inferno, Hell, Purgatorio, Purgatorium, and Paradiso, Heaven. Although it is generally regarded as a profound work of epic literature rich in symbolism, the Divine Comedy can also be viewed as a dangerous work in a medieval context, especially because of the ways in which it depicts sin, punishment, and moral judgment. Dante uses this work to illustrate his view of divine justice, with each sin receiving its due punishment in the afterlife. The Inferno, for example, depicts different types of sins from lies to murder, and each sin gets a very cruel and excessive punishment according to its equivalence, website. This concept can be very frightening and may influence readers to develop a narrow and fearful view of the afterlife. As such, this work reinforced the fear of sin and God's judgment, which can cause people to feel trapped in moral and spiritual uncertainty. One of the more problematic elements is the depiction of heretics and people considered heretics by the church, who in the Divine Comedy are placed in hell. Dante writes explicitly about figures who are considered wrong according to church teachings, such as Filippo Argenti, a politician alluded to in Inferno, or Epicurus and Aristotle, who fall into the circle of heretics because of their more secular views. Dante even criticizes figures who champion religious freedom and ideologies contrary to church dogma, which can be considered a direct attack on pluralism and freedom of thought. In addition, the Divine Comedy also contributed to the reinforcement of the social and moral hierarchy that was very strict at that time. The heavy emphasis on sin, punishment, and divine judgment solidified social norms that limited the freedom of individuals to make their own moral decisions. In medieval times, the Divine Comedy served as a kind of moral instruction for Catholics, which could encourage excessive fear of the afterlife and in some cases even lead to the suppression of people who were considered heretical or not in line with church teachings. Decretum Gratiani. Decretum Gratiani, or the Papal Decree, is a major work compiled by Gratian in the 12th century, which became the basis for the canon law of the Catholic Church. It combines the various canons of law from church councils, papal decrees, and church teachings into one comprehensive legal code. The Decretum played a key role in the formation of the Church's legal system that regulates almost all aspects of Christian life, including marriage, church finances, and church discipline. Although its purpose was to codify and unify the Church's scattered teachings, the work also served to strengthen the Catholic Church's authority in worldly affairs, giving the Pope and the Church hierarchy almost unlimited power. The Decretum contained many rules that gave the Church the right to regulate and control the social life of Catholics in a very strict and structured way. One of the most harmful impacts of the Decretum was how it validated and reinforced the Church's view that the authority of the Church was superior to that of the state. At the time, the Church already wielded enormous power, and with the Decretum it made it clear that church law could govern everything from the moral behavior of individuals to matters of politics and government. In practice, this meant that church leaders, especially the Pope, had the power to overturn political or governmental decisions that were deemed contrary to church teachings. Decretum even provides the basis for the judgment of people deemed heretical or against the teachings of the Church, and the Church has the right to try and punish them. The use of decretum in Inquisition trials is one example of a particularly dangerous application. Many people who were considered heretics, or even witches were put to death or tortured based on the principles outlined in this text. The decretum also helped to reinforce the patriarchal structure that heavily dominated medieval society, where women were often considered inferior to men, and their role was restricted to the family or household sphere. In addition, the decretum created a dangerous dependency between the church and the state, where the church was considered a legitimate power to govern temporal affairs. In many cases, this led to an abuse of power, where the church imposed its will beyond the bounds of morality and justice. Decretum became a tool to strengthen the church's dominance, often to the detriment of individual liberty and social justice. Tractatus de Hereticis Comburendis. Tractatus de Hereticis Comburendis is a treatise written by Heinrich Institorus, a famous German inquisitor, which explicitly justifies and encourages the burning of heretics as a way to root out heresy. The book was published in 1487, and although not as popular as Malleus Maleficarum, it had an enormous influence in pioneering and facilitating the policy of burning people who were considered heretics or held to teachings that were contrary to the doctrines of the Catholic Church. Institorus, known for his role in witch hunts, developed the theory that heretics were a great threat to the power and survival of the Catholic Church, as well as to the salvation of human souls. The Tractatus de Hereticis Comburendis provided guidelines on how to identify, accuse, and punish those deemed heretics, focusing on the severe punishment of burning at the stake. One of Institorus's main arguments was that heretics not only threatened the safety of their own lives, but also spread a spiritual disease that could be transmitted to others, causing them to be considered enemies of the state and God. This book is particularly dangerous because it provides theological and legal legitimization for violent acts committed by the church and state against people deemed heretics. In practice, the doctrines contained in the Tractatus de Hereticis were applied in many Inquisition tribunals across Europe, leading to witch hunts, the persecution of non-Catholic religious sects, and the burning of thousands of people alive. The Inquisition unequivocally stated that heretics should be treated like dangerous enemies of the state, and that the punishment of burning was a legitimate way to deal with them. The most harmful effect of the Tractatus de Hereticis was that it directly encouraged violence committed in the name of religion. The book exacerbated social inequalities, led to mass killings of people of different faiths, and exacerbated tensions between Catholicism and other religious traditions. The Inquisition, sparked by this work and the application of the laws that supported it, created an environment of fear and oppression, where anyone deemed not to follow the teachings of the Church could be put to death without a fair trial. The Tractatus de Hereticis also worsened views on freedom of thought and diversity of belief, as it encouraged the notion that only one religious view was valid, that of the Catholic Church. People who were different, whether in terms of beliefs or social views, were subjected to a policy of violence based on rigid, dogmatic views. The Imitation of Christ. The Imitation of Christ is one of the greatest spiritual works in the Christian tradition, written by the Dutch monk Thomas à Kempis in the 15th century, around the 1420s. The book is a guide to a deeper personal spiritual life, emphasizing simplicity, humility, and total devotion to God. Overall, The Imitation of Christ focuses on the life of Christ as the ideal living example, and calls Christians to imitate his life and teachings. The book has been translated into many languages and has become one of the most widely read and quoted works in church history. However, despite its aim to deepen the spiritual life, The Imitation of Christ can be considered dangerous in certain historical contexts, especially in its extreme view of the world and the human body. Some elements in the book emphasize a disregard for worldly life and a rejection of the pleasures of the world as a way to achieve closeness to God. In many ways, the work promotes a very strict ascetic view, which regards the material world and physical life as less important or even dangerous. The Imitation of Christ encourages adherents to avoid the pursuit of worldly happiness and pursue simplicity and self-sacrifice, which can lead to excessive guilt towards worldly things such as personal pleasures, entertainment, or success. Not only does this ascetic lifestyle create a very restrictive view towards healthy living, but it can also lead to suppression of the body and personal desires, which in some cases triggers feelings of inferiority or even unworthiness. In the context of medieval society, where the authority of the church was very strong, these kinds of teachings could exacerbate inequality, especially by positioning worldly life as bad or unimportant. Furthermore, although The Imitation of Christ focuses on the spiritual life of individuals, the text often ignores or trivializes the social and political aspects of human life. Society at the time relied heavily on strict social hierarchies, and The Imitation of Christ teaches to accept the circumstances of life without questioning the injustice or oppression happening around them. This could be considered dangerous in a context where inequality and feudal systems are profound, as it pacifies the sense of social injustice and emphasizes acceptance of existing conditions rather than change or improvement in the social structure. The Imitation of Christ also emphasizes submission to church authority and a spirituality that leads to total self-sacrifice, which can be used by the church to strengthen their domination over the lives of the people. While many of its teachings are positive in the context of spiritual development, there is the potential to psychologically and emotionally suppress individuals by convincing them that true happiness can only be found in the rejection of the worldly and in extreme humility. The Almagest. The Almagest, a classic astronomical work written by the mathematician and astronomer Claudius Ptolemy, is one of the most influential texts in the history of science, especially in the field of astronomy. The book presents the geocentric model, the Earth as the center of the universe, that persisted as the dominant view in Western astronomy for more than 1,400 years, until the advent of Copernicus's heliocentric theory in the 16th century. Ptolemy formulated a very complicated geocentric planetary system, which was based on observations and mathematical calculations that were quite accurate for its time, but at the same time introduced and reinforced a false understanding of the structure of the universe. The Almagest contains explanations of planetary motions, star positions, and astronomical table calculations, and develops a theory of planetary movements that uses the concepts of deferent and epicycle. In this Ptolemaic model, the Earth was considered the center of the universe, and all celestial bodies, including the Sun and planets, moved around the Earth in complex circular orbits. While the Almagest was mathematically precise in predicting the positions of the planets in its time, the geocentric view it portrayed was ultimately proven wrong. One of the reasons the Almagest can be considered harmful is that its influence dominated European scientific thought for so long. The geocentric model proposed by Ptolemy was seen as the absolute truth by the Church and scientists for over 1,000 years, despite many observations that later proved it to be wrong. This created inflexibility in the scientific world, hindered the development of more accurate scientific theories, and slowed down the scientific revolution that occurred during the Enlightenment. The dominance of the Church also played an important role in reinforcing the geocentric model. The Catholic Church at the time adopted this view as consistent with its interpretation of Scripture, which depicted the earth as the center of creation. The Almagest became a tool to support church dogma, and any theory that contradicted Ptolemy's geocentric model was considered heretical. One obvious example is the suppression of scientists like Galileo Galilei, who supported the heliocentric model. The sun is the center of the universe, which eventually sparked conflict with the Catholic Church and the courts of the Inquisition. Galileo was punished and forced to recant his views on heliocentrism, which did not conform to the views taught by the Church at the time. On a broader level, the Almagest was instrumental in reinforcing a very conservative scientific paradigm for centuries. The view of the Earth as the center of the universe not only slowed down the progress of astronomy, but also hindered a more precise understanding of humanity's place in the universe. Even after the discovery of heliocentrism, the geocentric concept persisted in some fields of thought until the 17th century. Overall, although the Almagest made a great contribution to the scientific understanding of its time and advanced mathematics and astronomy, its lasting influence on scientific and religious thought can be considered harmful because it limited scientific progress and reinforced dogmas that hindered more accurate discoveries. The book's influence helped maintain an erroneous model of the universe for a very long time, which exacerbated the inability to explore new theories that better matched real observations.